So we're going to look at dyslexia, which is a different way of thinking. And when we want to think about how a dyslexic thinks, we're going to look at the strengths and challenges that come with this way of thinking. Because dyslexia is a label that's given to a group of people who do it a different way and different from the norm. So with the challenges that a dyslexic has, dyslexia is a language processing issue, which means it takes more time and effort for them to learn to read and write and spell. And they struggle with phonological awareness, hearing the sounds that make up words. They have weak auditory processing, so they can have perfect hearing, but it's how their brain is processing the verbal information that's a challenge. And this can be things like if you give them verbal instructions, they cannot retain them. If you explain something to them that they're learning in the classroom and you move on to the next bit of information to explain another bit, they're still there with that first bit of information trying to work out and understand it. It can also be that if they're focusing on what you're saying and if there's a bit of noise elsewhere, like a couple of students talking or the hum of a heater, that can be enough to break their focus and concentration so they can't take in what you're saying. They also struggle with short-term memory, and this can impact on retaining information such as basic facts or spelling rules. It can impact on their reading because when they're reading a sentence, by the time they get to the end of the sentence, they haven't been able to remember what was at the start of the sentence. Also can impact in group work, having to remember what someone has said and then think about what their answer would do. That's going into their struggles with working memory. They also struggle with sequencing and ordering of information. And this can be in a couple of ways. So it's how they approach something, so how they get themselves organised to approach a task, so they do it in the order and the sequence that it needs to be done. For example, the steps needed to tie a shoelace, the steps needed to put their homework together and organised, or it can be the steps needed to get what's in their head down on paper. So that's thinking about how their writing is going to flow in an order and make sense. And they also need more processing time. And I think it's not because they're slower. I think it's because they're processing a higher amount of information. Their brain prefers information in a certain format. It's easier for their brain, especially if it's visual. So if they're getting verbal information, especially, or too much visual information, they have to work through it to convert it into a format that works for their brain. So that's where I think that they're just taking their time processing, going through quite a lot of information to put it in a format that they're going to better understand it. So those are the challenges. But we need to look at the whole part of a dyslexic learner and their thinking. So we really want to understand what their strengths are as well. And I've got here under strengths intelligence, and that's actually just there it's just to make you think, because it's actually got nothing to do with intelligence. Dyslexia, it doesn't matter where you sit on the intelligence spectrum, you can be dyslexic. But it's in there because there's some misconceptions that if you're dyslexic, you're not very smart. If you can't read and you're dyslexic, then you're not that smart. And quite often, dyslexics don't feel like they are smart or intelligent. So it's really in there just to make you think about what your expectations and perceptions are of a dyslexic learner. One of their big strengths is this big picture thinking, and they use their imagination to think about how something is going to work before they do it or before it's going to happen. And this can be something quite practical and mechanical, because they can work out how something is going to, they can fix something or make it work before they actually do it. Or it can be in crafts and art, where they might make it, do a picture and think about what it's going to look like, or sew some clothes and think how it's going to be and how they need to sew the bits of material together. It can also be on the sports field, and they're looking at how a play for the team is going to flow and who needs to be where for it to work. And it also can be just in processes and systems as well, and thinking about, well, if we get, this person doing this and this person doing this, we'll be able to get to the end by doing it this way. So they look at how all the parts work together to before they even start, and they know if it's going to work or not, or what needs to be changed. And this hooks into their problem-solving strength of being able to see how to approach a problem in a different way. And they do this, they're very solution-focused. They're looking about how can we make that more effective, more efficient? How can we make it better? And they connect large amounts of information from different sources, from what they felt, from what they saw, what they heard. And they connect that, and they pull all that information together to come up with these different solutions. And that's where you get the out-of-the-box thinking happening, because they're being able to, get that information from such a large variety. They also have this empathy with others. They have a really good ability to understand how other people feel. They can sense it. It is just something that's very innate with them. And so this can make them really good at working with people and pulling the best out of people, or understanding what people need in that moment. And they will take information in better if they can see it. They can still get overloaded with too much information, but there's a far better chance that they'll understand it and retain it if they can see it. So just as a recap, thinking about this dyslexic learner as a whole, there's challenges that they have and the strengths. So they struggle with processing language, so it affects how easily they learn to read and write and spell. They struggle with processing verbal information and retaining information and putting information in an order and a flow so it can make sense, and how they need more time to process so that the information fits their brain. And we look at their strengths, that they are intelligent learners just the way they are, that they have this strength of seeing the big picture of how it's all going to work before they start, that they can see how to come up with solutions and make things more efficient and effective, and using that strength of sensing how other people feel to get the most out of people around them, and that they take in information better if they can see it. So I've just wanted to talk about dyslexia runs in families, and that's one of the indicators we can use when it's in a family. And so if a parent's dyslexic, there's a 50% chance a child will be. With 15% of the population is dyslexic, a quarter of them are what we call compensated dyslexics, or sometimes you might hear high functioning or stealth dyslexia. But these dyslexics, these compensated dyslexics, have learned to read and write. And so what that means is they can generally go through the schooling system not too bad, at least the primary school, because their coping strategies for managing their dyslexia are, make it okay. So the characteristics of a compensated dyslexic is they usually have a really good ability, like short-term memory is not too bad, or good strategies to manage their poor short-term memory. They have, well-developed attention and problem-solving skills. So they're usually quite strong in visual memory. When they read by gist. So if they don't understand or know what a word means, they'll use their problem-solving and strengths and their general knowledge to work out what the meaning of what they're reading is. And so For example, if they're reading fiction books, that's fine because they can develop a picture in the head of what's happening. Where it shows up or where they have difficulties is, for example, with maths word problems, where you've got to know what each word means. Exam questions, same thing, because it impacts on how they answer. If they're reading without any context of knowing what they're reading about, and if they have to read out loud, so that puts pressure on having to know how to say each word and understand each word. So that they do struggle with periods of transition, and this is when their coping strategies that they normally use are put under stress, because the periods of transition usually include more work for their brain. And the periods of transitions can be going from primary school to high school. It can be going into exam, year 11, where you've got exams and there's increased workload. It can be the increased workload and transition going from high school to a tertiary institution or into a workplace. It can be the transition of moving from home into, out into the big wide world. That all puts increased stress on what they had been able to cope with before. So it's just giving you the big picture of that. Some dyslexics can compensate quite well and manage, but they still will have these underlying strengths and challenges. So they talk about how no two dyslexics are alike. And this is true because each person has their own unique profile. And what I see is the challenges and strengths that we have here, these dyslexic challenges and strengths, underneath it sits a person's own individual executive functioning profile, which then has an impact on how their dyslexia presents. So they're all on a spectrum, these challenges and strengths. So one dyslexic's short-term memory might be not as bad as another dyslexic's short-term memory. But what I do find is that the strengths seem to be quite consistent, that they are all big picture thinkers. They will default to problem solving, solution thinking, and they do have that strong empathy with others, and they prefer information if they can see it. So the challenges sit on a spectrum more so than the strengths, but they all do across the board. But what this thinking around the challenges and strengths gives us is a base point for knowing how to support dyslexic learners, because we know that if we accommodate for these challenges and utilize these strengths with how we present and how we teach, it's going to make a difference.